Samuel Green, with his serene countenance and eyes that seemed to shine an inner light, walked along a dusty road at dusk, the Bible under his arm, as usual. The tall trees that bordered the way whispered in the wind, their shadows lengthening like long, thin fingers who sought to touch the essence of the pastor. Every step was an act of faith, a silent testimony of his mission among the oppressed communities that sought their spiritual orientation. Born at a time when skin color was a cruelly imposed destination, Samuel had devoted his life to the word of the Lord, finding the strength in the gospel to endure and fight against the brutality of the world around him. His heart was a refuge of compassion and resistance, and his words a melody of hope that calmed the restless spirits of those who came to hear him. It was on a clear and cold morning, when dew still shone on the leaves like little diamonds, that Samuel received the book that would change not only his life, but also the fate of many around him. A longtime friend, a fervent abolitionist, handed him a copy of Father Tomas's Hut. The weight of volume in his hands seemed to have his own gravity, but not only paper and ink, but all the pain and hope of a people. In opening the book and walking his pages for the first time, Samuel felt a wave of emotion flooding him. Harriet Beecher. Stowe's words were like a lighthouse in darkness, illuminating injustices and inflammating the desire for change. For him, the story of Father Thomas was more than an account of resistance. It was a parable of spiritual liberation and a call to action. Each chapter read seemed to echo in the bottom of his soul, arousing memories of an ancestral suffering he knew too well. However, the impact that the book caused on his conscience did not go unnoticed in the eye on local authorities. For them, Father Tomas's cabin was a statement of war, a threat to the fragile balance of power that kept the slave system intact. Stowe's words were seen as a dangerous spark, capable of burning hearts and minds, inciting rebellions and questioning the status quo. As Samuel shared the stories of the book with those who sought his guidance, he noticed a subtle but powerful change in the expressions of the listeners. Looks that were once resigned now shone with determination. Resistance murmurs replaced the silence of submission. It was as if a new consciousness were emerging, an understanding that liberation was not just a distant dream, but an achievable goal. However, along with this growing hope, the imminent risk came. Samuel knew that rumors about his preaching had already reached the ears of those who feared the change. He felt the weight of every pronounced word, aware that the line between truth and danger was tenuous. Every sermon of his was a delicate dance between inspiration and subversion, an act of courage that could cost him everything. As the sun was on the horizon, dyeing the sky with shades of red and gold, Samuel prepared for another service. The stars began to emerge, silently witnessing the determination of a man who had chosen to fight with the only weapons he had, faith and the Word. He knew that the way ahead was uncertain and full of dangers, but was also aware that, like Father Thomas, he was not alone. In his heart, he carried the certainty that somewhere a change was preparing to be born, like an inevitable dawn after the longest night. The air was dense and loaded with omens that morning when Samuel Green's fate would lean toward the tragedy. The clouds accumulated on the horizon, heavy and threatening, as if heaven himself reflected the tension that permeated the village. The murmurs of discontent had become a restless cry, and the breeze that blew through the trees brought with it the whisper of an imminent danger. The crash occurred with the sudden violence of an unexpected storm. Uniformed men with harsh expressions and inquired eyes invaded Samuel's humble residence, scouring each corner with the determination of predators in search of a prey. The little house, which had so often had been a sanctuary of peace and reflection, now became the scene of a brutal invasion, where respect for human dignity was a forgotten concept. It was among the few possessions of Samuel who found the book. Father Thomas's cabin, resting on the wooden table spent, seemed to shine with his own light, as conscious of his transforming power. Men raised him like an infamous trophy, his pages opened to chance, exposed as irrefutable evidence of a crime that was otherwise the longing for freedom. For them, those words were more dangerous to any weapon, more subversive than any conspiracy. Samuel, standing in the midst of the chaos that swallowed his life, tried to explain that the book was just a reflection tool, a means of illuminating minds and comforting the afflicted spirits. His words, said with the calm of those who have the truth by their side, fell into deaf ears. For men who accused him, reading was an affront, a statement of war against the established order. Taken in custody, Samuel crossed the city streets, his firm and worthy steps, despite the currents that now adorned his wrists. Along the way, well-known faces appeared in windows, expressions of shock and sadness stamped in each feature. Those whom he had guided and comforted were powerless, their heavy hearts with the injustice that unfolded before their eyes. The trial was a carefully orchestrated scam, a convenience theater where the letters were already marked even before the first word was dictated. The court hall, impregnated with an oppressive formality, echoed with the crackling of gavets and muffled whispers. In the defendant's bank, Samuel remained erect, his fixed eyes not to us, but at one point beyond, where the truth and justice could still be dreamed. The jury, composed entirely of white men whose minds were closed to reason, rapidly deliberated. For them, the sentence was inevitable, a formality that only reaffirmed the control they exerted on every aspect of the lives of those they considered inferior. Thus the condemnation was uttered, and with it Samuel's hope of remaining among his was cruelly torn. 10 years in prison. The sentence resonated in the room like thunder, silenced any protest, any attempt to appeal. However, within Samuel, something remained unshakable. He knew that although his body was destined for the shadows of a cell, his fight was not lost. The seeds of resistance that they had planted would continue to grow, fed by the memory of his words and the strength of the example he had left behind. While being taken away, the previously charged sky was beginning to open, revealing a narrow strip of light that cut the clouds. For Samuel, that light was an omen of hope, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, dawn would always come. And so, with the faith that had always guided him, he advanced, knowing that his story would not end there, but would live in the hearts of those who would continue the struggle for freedom and justice. The air inside the cell was cold and damp, carrying the bittersweet smell of rust and despair. The gray stone walls seemed to absorb all the heat, leaving only a sharp cold that penetrated to the bones. The light that entered the bars of the small window was pale and scarce, a cruel reminder of the freedom that was now denied to him. However, Samuel Green, with the serenity of a man whose spirit could never be imprisoned, rose over that dismal environment as a lighthouse in the storm. He observed the cell around him, every detail recorded in the mind as a map of his new reality. The shadows danced around them, shaped by the nuances of dusk, while the chains and steps were echoed through the hall, composing a sin-force and resistance symphony. Samuel, however, did not allow himself to be consumed by the darkness that surrounded him. Instead, he focused on the mission that was still pulsed within him, a mission that transcended those walls. The other prisoners, men of hardened eyes and fragmented hopes, observed him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. For them, Samuel was not just another imprisoned man, but a symbol of something larger, a spark of courage that challenged the fate to which everyone seemed condemned. And it was to them that Samuel began to preach, not with the loud voice of the sermons in a public square, but with the softness of a whisper that infiltrated the soul. With a calm gesture, he opened his mental Bible, those pages that lived so long in his mind and heart, and began to speak. His words were loaded with an ancient wisdom, intertwined with fragments of the novel that had cost him freedom. The stories of Father Thomas and the teachings of the gospel merged into a narrative that resonated hard in every corner of that cell, offering such vivid hope that it was palpable. "It's not the chains that attach me," he said, his voice echoing among the cold walls, "but the fear they have of the truth." To each word was an arrow, directed to the core of the uncertainties and fears that inhabited the hearts of the men around them. And as he heard him, the prisoners began to raise their eyes, to erect their heads, as if the hope that Samuel offered were a rope thrown into the abyss of his existence. In the following days, Samuel's cell 1 is a meeting point for those who longed for more than mere survival. Men gathered around them, eager for their words, their stories that transformed suffering into resistance and despair into determination. And so, even inside the stone walls, a community of souls began to form, united by the invisible thread of hope. Samuel became a pastor of minds and hearts, sowing ideas of freedom and justice on a terrain that many would consider sterile. His message was clear. The prison was only a temporary circumstance, but the seeds planted in their minds could flourish in freedom, even if their bodies were trapped. He encouraged each man to find his own voice, to use language as a powerful weapon against oppression. Over time, Samuel's words have echoed beyond the prison walls, such as a river that refuses to be contained. Guards and visitors began to notice the change in prisoners, the silent force emanating from them. And so, without realizing it, Samuel Green had become not only a symbol of intellectual resistance, but a living legend, proof that the human spirit cannot be tamed. Even as the nights stretched out endless and the days fused into each other, Samuel kept his faith unshakable. He knew that his life had a greater purpose, and that his sacrifice would not be in vain. And so, inside the cold cell, he continued to write his story, not ink, but with the courage of his conviction, aware that the words he pronounced were the seeds of a freedom that would one day flourish to everyone. The news of the arrest of Samuel Green, a trained pastor not for rebellion, but for the simple act of reading, spread like an uncontrolled fire, fueled by the indignation and passion of all those who opposed the slave system. In the North, where the air seemed lighter and the ideas of freedom found fertile ground to flourish, Samuel's history became a war against the hypocrisy that permeated society. In illuminated halls and bustling streets of the northern cities, fervent abolitionists gathered, their voices raising in unison against the injustice that had been committed. For them, Samuel's incarceration was not only outrage, but a clear representation of the cruelty and irrationality of a system that feared the power of words rather than any armed rebellion. The image of the pastor, serene and unshakable, became a powerful symbol, a headlight that could not be ignored. Renowned newspapers, whose pages were devoured by avid readers, stamped Samuel's case in their headlines with inflamed articles that demanded their immediate release. The printed words, loaded with a palpable urgency, echoed in every corner of the country, instigating heated debates on taverns and social meetings. "A man of God, arrested for seeking the truth," the headlines said, and the injustice of this reality infiltrated the hearts of all those who read. The Free Samuel Green campaign, born of the fervor of certain abolitionists, quickly gained strength. Shepherds of various denominations, united for a greater cause, were in churches and squares, their preaching resonating with a message of solidarity and justice. Writers and poets, with their sharp penalties, made up verses and rehearsals that captured the essence of the struggle for freedom, their words becoming weapons in a battle fought on paper. Activists of all origins, their voices a cacophony of passion and determination, joined in a common cause. They organized rallies and marches, their flags fluttering in the wind, in a parade of courage and hope. Throughout the country, letters were sent to the authorities, each one piece of a mosaic of resistance, requiring injustice to be corrected, that Samuel be released to continue his mission to illuminate the minds and hearts of those who lived under the yoke of oppression. At abolitionist meetings, the figure of Samuel was evoked with reverence, his actions discussed as if they were those of a modern martyr. For many, he was more than a pastor. He was a prophet, whose visions of a fairer world inspired all those who longed for change. Every word he had pronounced, every sermon he had delivered, reverberated in the minds of those who followed him, inciting a passion that could not be erased. Meanwhile, in the dark walls of prison, Samuel, oblivious to the magnitude of his influence, continued to preach, his words echoing as a song of hope among the prisoners. He was unaware of the movement that his name had inspired, the wave of solidarity that swept the country in his name. However, in his heart, he felt a deep connection with those who shared his dream of freedom, a certainty that even in darkness, his light still shone. As the days became weeks, and the weeks in months, the Free Samuel Green campaign showed no signs of weakening. On the contrary, it grew in strength and number, its supporters multiplying like the stars on a clear night. The clamor for justice became impossible to ignore, and the previously safe authorities of their power began to feel the pressure of an inevitable change. And so, in the distant margins of the country, where the struggle for freedom was fought with words and actions, the story of Samuel Green was still written, not only the story of a man, but of a movement, a nation that was beginning to awaken to the truth that justice and freedom were inalienable rights of every human being. And while the campaign intensified, a new dawn seemed to approach, promising a future where reading would not be a crime, but a way to liberation. The prison gates opened with a grimed crane, as if reluctant to release the man who had become a symbol of resistance and hope. The freedom breeze gently blew into Samuel Green's face, bringing with it the fresh smell of a world he hadn't seen for 4 years. It was a mixture of damp land and vegetation, the aroma of life that continued to pulse beyond the iron and stone barriers. He took a deep breath, feeling the air fill his lungs, each molecule a promise of renewal. By crossing the threshold between the shadow and the light, Samuel hesitated for a brief moment. The eyes, used to the dim spine of the cell, blinked against the glow of the rising sun that emerged on the horizon. It was as if the star herself grew him, dyeing the sky with gold and red tones, a silent greeting to the man who never lost sight of her inner truth. In his gaze there was an unsure serenity, a glow that spoke of an indomitable spirit, a faith that had never been cowed by oppression. Although time had marked him with lines of wisdom, Samuel remained unchanged in essence. His heart, an irreducible bastion of compassion and resistance, continued to hit the same firmness as before. He walked with decided steps, the dust rising gently under his feet, as if the world was eager to welcome him back. Around it, The landscape seemed to sing a welcome melody, the birds trimming their notes in a natural concert. Samuel, still wrapped in the aura of his mission, has never reneged the power of the words that led him to prison. On the contrary, he hugged them even more fervently, aware of the impact they could have on hearts and minds. Each syllable he pronounced was a tribute to the truth, each sentence a statement of his unshakable belief in the ability to change. In prison, he had learned that words were like dispersed seeds in the wind, germinating even under the most adverse conditions. Over time, it became impossible to imagine it without a book in the hands. The pages he flipped into were more than a refuge. They were an extension of their own soul. The texture of paper under his fingers was comforting, a tactile reminder that knowledge and wisdom were his most loyal allies. He read with a renewed intensity, his eyes traveling the lines with an insatiable hunger for understanding and truth. As he walked the city streets, those who knew him or just heard of his history watched him with reverent respect. Samuel was a living testimony of human resilience, a headlight that continued to shine even after the darkest of the nights. People clustered around them, eager for their words, for their guidance. He became a pastor again, not only of faith, but of hope, his preaching resonating as a murmur of freedom that spread slowly throughout the community. They never looked at him like just a man, but as the symbol of a larger movement, a reminder that justice and freedom were battles that were worth being fought. And so Samuel walked between them, an ever-present book, his heart full of love and determination. He knew that true freedom was not only the absence of chains, but the presence of opportunities for everyone, a future in which knowledge was not a threat, but a celebration. Samuel's freedom was not just a return to life he had known before prison, but a restart, a rebirth. He was determined to continue his mission to illuminate minds and comfort the spirits, to use each word as a brick in building a fairer and more equitable world. And so, with the eternal brightness in his eyes and a book ever within his reach, Samuel Green walked toward a future that he would help shape, one page at a time. The wind was gently whistled between the fields of wheat, carrying with it the murmurs of a story that refused to be forgotten. The golden leaves swing at rhythm D, and an ancient melody, a symphony of freedom that echoed through the valleys and hills where the shadow of slavery was beginning to dissipate. Samuel Green's legacy, the pastor who had dared to challenge the invisible currents of fear with the most powerful weapons, his words and his courage had become an indomitable force, a flame that illuminated the way to a fairer future. Samuel's narrative was not just a chronicle of resistance, but a testimony of the overwhelming force that ideas had. At a time when slavery seemed unqualified, sustained by centuries of cruelty and oppression, the mere notion of freedom was a spark that could burden hearts and minds. And it was exactly this spark that Samuel, with his preaching and the book that had changed his life, helped spread. Father Thomas's Cabin has become more than a simple volume. It was a silent manifesto whose words resonated in the minds of those who longed for change. Throughout America, the story of Samuel was told and recounting, each turnaround of his life a lesson of courage and resilience. In schools and churches, in clandestine meetings and resplendent halls, he was celebrated as a hero of the word, a man who had understood the transforming power of knowledge. Through his struggle, the book that once had been a weapon in his condemnation had become a symbol of emancipation, a catalyst for the abolitionist movement that intensified every day. In the homes of the abolitionists, Samuel's name was pronounced with reverence, a constant memory that true freedom began in mind. When the voices rose in protest, when the steps of the protesters echoed the streets, Samuel's spirit marched beside them, invisible but undeniably present. He had become a martyr of the word, his sacrifice an inspiration to all who refused to accept the currents of injustice as unchanging. While the abolitionist movement gained strength, Samuel's words continued to reverberate, not only in his home country, but also beyond his borders. In England, France, everywhere where freedom was more than a distant dream, its story was told as a reminder that oppression could not and should not prevail. The seeds he had planted in the fertile soil of hope began to germinate, his roots infiltrating the foundations of a system that could no longer support himself. But Samuel's legacy was not limited to the battlefield of abolitionism. In his own community, he had left an indelible mark, an inheritance of wisdom and compassion that continued to guide those who had known him. The children who grew up listening to their stories have learned that knowledge was a light, a force that no one could tear to them. Adults, inspired by Samuel's example, found the courage to fight for their rights, to lift their voices against the injustices they faced. A school was erected in its memory, a modest but imbued construction of a grand purpose. Within its walls, young minds were shaped, fed by the same passion as Samuel guided. There, the book that had once been forbidden was openly read, its pages fired at the reverence of those who understand their true value. And so Samuel's story was still written, not ink, but with the actions of those he had inspired. As time passed, the figure of Samuel Green transcended his own mortality. He had become a legend, a living proof that ideas could indeed release even before the chains broke. In a world that was just beginning to awaken to the truth that justice was an inalienable right of all, Samuel's legacy was a headlight that could not be erased. He had shown that the true revolution began within each other, in the choices they made, in the words they pronounced. And so, as the sun was on the golden fields, dyeing the sky with the colors of a new dawn, Samuel Green's legacy remained. He continued to live in the stories that were told, in the lessons that were taught, in the hearts that had been touched by his courage. And so, the man who had dared to read a forbidden book entered history, not just as a martyr, but as a visionary whose faith in words transformed the world around him.